week. The two gentlemen, Dr. Barack Muluka, shoots from the hip, is right here in studio with me, and of course Steve Ogola, an advocate of the High Court, Kenya. He is one that says it's as plainly as it comes. He's also here with me in studio. Gentlemen, thank you for coming today on News Hour. Let me begin with what happened last week. It's something that we saw on our screens. It was reported about the by-election in Matungu and Kabuchai. Your translation of what occurred there, Barack?
First, it was very chaotic, Ken. There was violence. As you have already seen, some of the matters are already before the courts, and therefore we have to be a little cautious just how far we can go with that. And it was not altogether unexpected. Remember that we were here the day before the elections, and in my closing remarks, I remember mentioning something about Matungu, Kabuchai, and the other places, and my fear that we were headed for a violent by-election, basically because, in my view, we have been sidestepping the issues that trouble us. And I think that is a warning shot for us. Remember that there were also by-elections in other parts of the country. There was a by-election in Nakuru, which also turned quite violent. Another one somewhere in Kisii was also quite violent. In fact, in Nakuru, there were two. There was one in London, and there was another one in Naivasha, which essentially, anyway, is also in Nakuru County. Yes. So the big lesson here really is that we must start confronting what ails our country and refrain from sidestepping issues.
I'd like to ask you if it's a precursor to what we might witness in 2022, but let me take this to the lawyer. Steve, there are people in court. Let's talk about the people who are not in court. And one of the things that Junet Mohammed said is if ODM was involved in that kind of rabsha, that kind of violence, today they'll be asking the heads of those parties to take full responsibility. Is there vicarious liability when it comes to issues that happen in the political field?
I think, first of all, Ken, the recent or the just concluded by-election is a textbook example of institutionalized political impunity that sadly adversely affected the credibility, integrity, and the purity of the electoral process. And it's a point of concern because we're always quick to blame IBC for not managing an election to the expectation of certain quarters, political quarters, but we are slow to condemn and demand action against the political elite when they instigate and fund political violence, of course, in a very decided move to alter the outcome of an election. I think from what we saw, both political divides are as guilty as the other side. It's very unfortunate that, especially in Matungu, we saw that violence being meted by ANC supporters and ODM supporters. And of course, political accountability will rest with the party leadership, but individual accountability, criminal culpability, will always rest with the people who are apprehended and charged in court.
Okay.
In London, there's also recorded or documented instances of open voter bribery, which is an election offense. What is more disturbing is that these seem to have been supervised by the security agencies that are supposed to ensure compliance with the law. If this is a projection of what 2020 looks like, I don't think we can have elections that respect the constitutional threshold. And that really is a strong indictment on the political class, not just the IBC, as we always like to put it.
And this time, the IBC actually took a beating, literally. We saw what happened to a lady. It was very unfortunate. But still, you maintain, Steve, that the people who are arrested take this load. What happens to the other people? Because they looked as though there was a blank check. So long as it goes the ANC way or the Ford Kenya way, it did not matter. Did you get that sense, Steve?
No, here's the thing, and I think we've said this before. You know, in Kenya, and Kenyans need to understand and appreciate this, and then probably begin to organize, and then organize differently. In Kenya, elections don't matter. Results matter. if you get the results that you desire, then the process is okay. The process doesn't really matter if the results favor your party candidate. And that is a problem. That is a problem that we inherited from the past. The Constitution tried to shift us away from that, but because you have a stubborn political culture of impunity, what my senior Barack calls the framework of impunity as our governing philosophy or organizing philosophy, then you will see condemnation being framed around people who have lost election, and the people who have won, whether they have won through a philosophy of impunity or not, then it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
I think the election in Matungu particularly is fit for reversal, and it's very, very sad that political leaders can assault IBC election management officials. I mean, you can't get lower than that.
Yeah. And Steve, bribery, open bribery, documented bribery is a ground for nullification of an election, if I'm not wrong.
Certainly yes, certainly yes. And I think the point that we must recast is this. Why are we always quick to blame and condemn IBC when election offenses are committed by candidates? I mean, had there been the instance that an IBC official was found in a compromising position,
to be a different,
you know, right now the political elite would be up in arms. But you see political leaders and their agents openly bribing.
Yeah, documented.
Documented.
Yes.
I mean, this is shocking. I think
election day, pre-election day, all those things.
If that election is not reversed, then I don't know what can be reversed.
All right. Barack, precursor 2022, do you see this going into 2022? Look at the kind of things that happened. For some political parties, it was a do or die. Moses Wetangula's Ford Kenya, and of course, ANC's Musalia Mudavadi. It was a do or die. Those were their seats, and they had to recapture them at all costs, including violence.
I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is in terms of what we may want to call winners and losers, and the other one is in terms of the process itself. In terms of winners and losers, you may want to ask who are the dramatis personae who was really concerned. And you heard when they were on the stumps doing the campaigns, virtually the leading trumpets were all in Matungu and Kabuchai. People were mobilized from all corners of the country to go and root for their candidates. Of course, that will not happen at that time because everybody will be in their own constituency. But there's also the question of which parties fielded who. I saw that Honorable Junet Mohammed of ODM was here a little earlier, and he was hedging some of the questions that you are putting to him, particularly in the second part of the interview where you asked him whether the orange was shrinking. And it is true that the orange is shrinking. That ODM, which has been a very strong party in Western, did not field a candidate in Kabuchai. That is a matter of primary concern. That in fact, when you talk about the Matungu seat, it was previously held by ODM before ANC took
same person,
it,
David Were, who they were trying to bring
David Were, whom they were trying to field. And you can see that it represents fading fortunes, and that those fading fortunes, you could also see them even in Luo Nyanza itself. In the case of Ugenya, which again ODM lost by-election here in Nairobi, in Embakasi South, where again they lost a by-election. But of course, one always wants to talk in terms of that which seems to favor them. So that is one side of that coin. We may want to ask ourselves about which parties we seem to be seeing fielding candidates across the country. In that regard, even Jubilee itself, which is the party in government, failing to sponsor candidates, it's also become a provincial party sitting in a small corner somewhere. And this is worrying because we are seeing that parties are now getting into a situation where they are saying this is our corner, leave it for us, and we are going to support you in another corner elsewhere.
But Dr. Muluka, it will be an exercise in futility if they were just to fill because there's a vacancy.
Ken Mijungu, you don't build a national party by ducking elections. You must field candidates, even places where
you're sure you won't win.
You're sure that you are not going to win. How are you going to grow that party? You can see that UDF, for example, which is a fairly new and youthful party fielded in all these places, I don't think that they expected that they were necessarily going to win.
Okay.
But that is how you start telling your members that we are around.
Okay.
That's how you start telling the country that we are around. But if you are going to play a defensive game, Ken, even as a young man, I used to play football. And you know, when you are playing a defensive game, then the ball is staying in your court for far too long, and the likelihood that you are going to concede a goal is very high.
Right. Okay.
You play an attacking game. You go out there and field candidates and get your members in different parts of the country to know that you are there. Finally, Ken, continued to be worried about the reality that the BBI has not addressed ODM's or NASA's 11 irreducible minimums of 2017. You have not seen them in the BBI bill.
I'm going to talk about that. It's one of the topics we're discussing, Dr. So we'll go into that. Unless, Steve, you have a comment on this. I think something happened over the weekend. There was two areas that two leaders spoke. And Junet also said that he also spoke. But I want you to listen to what James Orengo Sr. and Otenda Molo Sr. said over the weekend. And let's try and analyze and look through what they said.
House and all government institutions which are subject to civilian authority should keep away from the question of determining the political leadership that will arise in the year 2022. That is not their responsibility. Some of them tried when Kibaki was retiring. They didn't succeed. During the first Kenyatta government, they tried, they didn't succeed. And even this one, they are not going to succeed. So we plead with them, do your job. All servants must be subject to political authority, to civilian authority. And we know what these characters are trying to do to determine who becomes president in the year 2022. Those characters are undermining the authority and the goodwill and the vision of Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga.
There are those who think that they can belittle the handshake and introduce other foreign elements and other foreigners and take us elsewhere. We want to remind them that where we were in 2018, as of February, Nyasachiel Wanyalodo Kanyo anytime, Katasani.
For Otenda Amolo to have spoken in Luo, he must have really wanted to emphasize that point. But gentlemen, I want you to look at this thing in two ways. One, could Otenda Amolo Sr. and James Orengo Sr. have spoken without the blessing of ODM? And could the civil servants in question have acted without the blessings of President Uhuru Kenyatta? Steve.
I think, first of all, we must acknowledge that politics is about interest formation, and interests keep on shifting and displacing personalities. But what I find curious is that, and probably I empathize with the ODM leadership, because they are now decrying the scheme by certain members of the civil society, top high-ranking civil society members, that are working behind the scenes to undermine party leader, the Right Honorable Prime Minister's presidential bid. But at the same time, remember Dr. Oburu Odinga celebrated the very civil societies whom we call the deep state,
yes,
as now working to advance the interests of ODM. So I think one is left wondering, can you really approbate and reprobate your support for the deep state? Or is it only when it's advancing your interest, and when it starts disadvantaging you? You know, when it's advancing your interest at the expense of another person, then the deep state is a good thing. And when it's working against your interest, ostensibly for another person's interest, then now it's a bad thing. I think what is coming out clear is this. First, within the meaning of the Constitution, civil society members, from a purely constitutional viewpoint, should not be meddling in political questions. They should be leading in governance and performing tasks.
Did you say civil society or the civil servants?
The civil servants.
Yes.
Civil servants.
Yes.
The civil servants and public officers, from a constitutional viewpoint, should not be meddling into politics. But the political elite sometimes encourage the public servant, the civil servants and public officers to meddle into politics, especially if their interference in political actions and decisions tend to advance their political interests. So the political elite, what is good for the goose must be good for the gander. If you support if you support the interference of the deep state, properly so-called, then you must also be slow to condemn it when they shift positions. But what is the reinvigorating message I see in all this is that Kenyan politics has not really changed. Kenyan politics is framed on the philosophy of betrayal and interest formation, and there's no absolute assurance that the handshake will deliver unqualified support to Raila Odinga or any other candidate. It could as very much mean that towards the end of Jubilee's term, the president and the deputy president could work together. Or it could as well very well mean, and you asked Honorable Junet right here, that if the ODM leadership feel excluded within the handshake, they could retreat and reconsider working with the deputy president. So it's all about interest formation, and Kenyans need not to take this sentiment seriously. But I take great exception at the political leadership threatening violence so liberally and without any consequences or any sense of shame. I mean, this country, the peace in this country cannot be dependent on the mood or the feelings or the passion and discretion of certain political elites, that you can decide when we have peace and you can decide when the country slides back into violence. I think that is unacceptable. I haven't seen the party leadership of the ODM or the Jubilee, the president himself, coming out very strongly to condemn this statement. In fact, if what was reported is true, that the highly billed ODM rally in Kamkunji was called off partly because the president's intervention, then the president may have inadvertently played into politics of blackmail, which then reinforces the political perception that if you threaten violence, then you may get what you want. We don't want political leaders to get what they want because they're threatening violence. Okay. We want them to get what they want because they've persuaded us that they stand for what Kenyans really want. Oh, yeah. Not because they're going to trade peace for violence as a precursor to getting what they want. I think that is unfortunate.
Like a lawyer, you have explained all that, but you haven't told me, do you think they did that without the blessing of their leader? And do you think the civil servants will be acting without the blessing of Uhuru Kenyatta? Because I want to ask a specific question. Where does that leave the handshake? So perhaps answer, then I go to Dr. Muluka.
No, I think we say also in law, no one knows the mind of man except
no one can try the mind of man.
Except the Lord himself.
You're being clever.
No one knows the mind of man except the Lord himself. But certain political voices amplify the concerns of certain political leadership. So it's not really too much to stretch our imagination to think that they could be amplifying the concerns of Raila Odinga, and maybe the civil servants that are interfering or undermining the handshake could also be doing so with the tacit support of certain quarters that want to manage the ODM leadership or the ODM involvement in the handshake. Because the thing is this, I hear political leaders on either side saying that the handshake and BBA is not about 2020. And I think I've clarified this point. Nothing can be further from the truth.
Obviously, they won't admit it, Steve.
The handshake and BBI is calculated to exclude William Ruto from succeeding Uhuru Kenyatta. Okay. I mean, this is so settled, you have to be a fool or a crook not to see that. The other thing, ODM is using the handshake, and it's not bad at all. What is bad is the idea, the attempt to camouflage what is hidden in plain sight. ODM is trying to use the handshake to advance Raila's political career. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That is for political actors to decide. But what Kenyans must not accept is to be cornered to a position where you think that politicians organizing the space ahead of 2022 will not use the handshake or BBI processes
for their
to extract political dividend. I think that would be too lazy to accept that kind of explanation.
Dr. Muluka, is this one leg in the hot water? Let's see what our partners can do, and then we can decide what to do with them.
I think it is a clear case of blackmail, intimidation, and I want to agree with Steve Ogola on at least 2 counts. First, that you do not start threatening the country, telling the country that if so-and-so does not become the president, if there are people who are going to put roadblocks and hurdles in the way, then there will be no country. That is extremely unfortunate, especially coming from a very senior lawyer, someone who is respected globally of the standing of senior counsel James Orengo, telling us, and without elaborating, that there are people who are putting hurdles in the way. So this is a clear case of blackmail. There's one leg inside, one leg outside. Junet Mohammed was here, and he was hemming and hawing. He was hedging around the questions that you are asking him, trying to suggest that all was very well. The other thing that I want to agree on with Steve Ogola is, of course, that the BBI is being organized as a vehicle of short-term political interests in the Uhuru succession, or even in the Uhuru perpetuation, howsoever one may want to look at it. And the owners of the initiative have every right to do so. When you're in politics, you try to put in place the best mechanisms to lead you where you want to go. But the pronouncements that were made over the weekend by Orengo and Otiende tell the lie of what is the BBI. I've said here repeatedly, Ken, that the BBI is not addressing the issues. The handshake is not addressing the issues. The handshake and the BBI are factors that were born out of the violence of 2017. And the violence of 2017 was not because there were not enough seats in the executive. That violence was not because we did not have 35% of the national revenue going to the counties. It was not a factor of not having huge enough numbers of representation in parliament. It was a factor of flawed elections.
Okay.
Whether those elections were stolen or they were just perceived to have been stolen, that was the crux of the matter. And that is the thing that we should be seeing in the BBI. Now we are in a situation where somebody has been gloating around, telling the country that we now have the deep state. And therefore, the 11 irreducible minimums that NASA had placed on the table in 2017 are forgotten. We can have a flawed election. It can be stolen, provided that the deep state is going to steal it for us.
Okay.
So when you start seeing that things are starting to behave differently, that the bell seems to be beginning to toll for you, you start getting very jittery, and you have asked the question, were they doing it without the knowledge and consent of Raila Odinga, of President Uhuru Kenyatta? My answer will be very cryptic and it should be very brief, Ken, that Raila Odinga keeps on telling us, at least he used to in the old days, that when the dog is barking, seek not to address the dog, seek to address the owner of the dog. And we know the owners of these dogs.
All right. Away from that, let's take a look at this, because this was also fundamental in my discussion earlier with Junet. But it's not them who have spoken these words. It's Moses Kuria, and it's twice. And I think in politics there's no coincidence, and twice is a little too much. Let's listen in.
Kama Rais Ruto amechengwa na mimi sitakubali hata Raila achengwe. Kwani tutatengana mpaka saa ngapi? Saa hizi zote Raila na Ruto tutaungana pamoja to face Manon.
It is my prediction, so you cannot take me to
Umekuwa nabii, okay.
Huwezi kunipeleka
Nabii wa
kotini.
siasa.
It's not
Haya,
even
another prediction.
Raila Odinga and William Ruto will work together
Yeah. When?
in 2022.
What makes you say so? They work together as an handshake or before the elections?
Before.
They work together before the elections?
Yes.
Not after the elections?
Na kuna watu wataachwa kwa mata.
And of course, Barack, you did the post-interview analysis for Raila Odinga, and one of the things that I asked him was, would you work with William Ruto again, because you worked with him in ODM? And he said, all factors conspiring. Why not?
Yes, and you asked me that question on another occasion on this show, and my answer was that in the electoral season, it doesn't matter who has been doing what, who has been saying what. The political elite are like canines in the season of fertility. They don't choose.
Steve.
I'm still absorbing the wisdom from Barack. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing fundamentally wrong with political leaders working together. But there's something, I mean, in principle, yeah? But there's something disturbing about the lack of settled principles and philosophies that are discernible, yeah, and distinguishable. I mean, why would we have ODM and Jubilee if they can always collapse into one political entity? Why would we, and this is the deterioration of political commitment and decency within our political leadership. The crisscrossing of parties is what is stalling our political maturation. The lack of a settled culture of ideological and philosophical disposition in our political governance is what is stalling our democratic maturation. If we leave it to politics, I think we have to reach a point where we begin to stop apologizing to politicians for just working with each other when they want, and to begin to hold them to account. What is it that sets William Ruto apart in terms of ideology from Raila Odinga or from ODM and in Kalonzo and so on and so forth? Because if they're just birds of the same feather, flying towards a particular political direction, competing for power, negotiating across the way, along the way, how they can share power, then we don't need these political parties. We may as well, in fact, if you look at the political movements lately, Ken, you may realize that we are almost touching on a de facto one-party system, because the voice of the political opposition has been extinguished. I mean, you have to check again, and it's been long since he invited John Badi, the leader of minority, if he still is. The voice of the leader of minority, the voice of the political opposition has been diminished, if not entirely extinguished. Why? Because of political developments in the last 2 years. Yet the Constitution has created a specific office, ordained it as the leader of minority, and funded it. So I think it's not a good thing to just apologize and say, interest formation, let them work together if they want. If they want to form, and if they want to collapse into one party, then there will be alternatives. There's the Third Way Alliance, there's the civil society, there's the Professor Kibwanas. There are many voices that should come and create an alternative. If the so-called Big Five want to come together, every time they are able to agree on a particular interest.
Okay.
And then we find a stable alternative and let Kenyans explore that alternative. Because what we are doing is that we are undermining the process of a political maturity because of short-term political interest.
But Steve, what is wrong with parties deciding to work together? Because in my view, is that after the election, we should stop the politicking and work. So if we would stop politics or politicking and work, what is wrong with parties actually sitting together and deciding to work and giving an environment that the ruling class or the ruling party thrives? What would be wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with parties working together, but they must work together within the pathway already ordained and defined by the Constitution. When you're the leader of minority, it does not mean that you contradict and criticize the government of the day all the time. You can isolate areas that you find agreeable and support that agenda. You can isolate what you think is not being progressed the right way and speak to it. But what we see now is a conspiracy of silence, yeah? Where you see no evil, speak no evil. Just because the politics of the day favor your position, you get?
Yeah.
But that is where the fundamental problem is, because as we race towards 2022, when these coalitions begin to collapse and disintegrate, you will then want to
Which one?
convince
Because
us.
they're no longer there. Which one?
I think there's an emerging alliance between ODM and the Jubilee wing of
Okay.
the Keleoke wing of Jubilee. There's an emerging alliance between the former NASA leadership and KANU. There's an emerging alliance between the Tanga wing of Jubilee and like-minded leaders drawn from individual political leadership. So alliances are forming, which is okay in principle, but towards the end of, as we race towards the finish, when these alliances start shifting, collapsing, and new alliances start emerging, it is not beyond our imagination that ODM can turn against Jubilee and start criticizing Jubilee. I think at that time, if we get to that point, we should be careful to remember that for the last 3 years, there was a conspiracy of silence because things worked in favor of ODM, and ODM thought they could advance their overall political goal through this conspiracy of silence. If they have been shortchanged, because that is sure to happen, because if it happens, you should be surprised, because the principle, the undergirding principle is that of betrayal. Kenyan politics and betrayal is just almost assured, yeah? I think that is where the problem really is. We are not able to grow our political parties and our institutions because they lack ideological and philosophical disposition. We don't have a settled understanding what these parties stand for.
Okay.
We only care that towards the election, they cobble up a coalition that can produce a winning team.
Okay. Dr. Muluka, same question, but I want to look at it differently because Raila Odinga has been in the opposition. Let me take you to the recent past, 2002 election, where KANU was in the opposition. Then we had CORD in the opposition. Then we had NASA in the opposition before it disintegrated. It's just because we had a vibrant Raila Odinga that the opposition voice was very strong. But even in with the absence of Raila Odinga, Musalia Mudavadi is very critical of the government when it comes to the economy. Why must it be Raila Odinga to be very vibrant in the opposition for that voice of the opposition to be felt? Because anyone can criticize the government. You don't need to be Raila Odinga to make it look so vibrant, because there's a lot of seriousness that comes with the pronouncements of Raila Odinga also.
Well, it is not necessarily his preserve, nor is it indeed the preserve of any one individual, because the opposition is a spirit, and it is the spirit of the alternative voice. In fact, Ken, in a language such as my mother tongue, there is no distinction between spirit and voice. We use the same word for spirit and voice. So the opposition is a spirit. Even in the one-party politics days of KANU, even after it had been made a de jure one-party state, we still had opposition voices. And when one person moves from the corner of speaking for the opposition to either being silent or joining the government and therefore not speaking, because it is a common village wisdom that an eating mouth cannot also be a talking mouth. When a mouth is eating and it is talking, it's likely to bite itself. So you leave people who have moved from one corner to the other, and you start asking yourself, so who is going to speak for us? What is our experience here in Kenya? Our experience here in Kenya is that in the 1960s we had the opposition, which was clearly led by KADU, and KANU was the party that formed the government. But within a very short while, the opposition had been swallowed in KANU. And KANU, therefore, bifurcated into two. You had now the radicals, and then you had the moderates. And who was the leader of the radicals? The leader of the radicals was, of course, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, and who was the vice president of the newly independent Republic of Kenya. do we seem to be seeing a mirror image of the same things happening today? That those who have been in the opposition have been subsumed into government, and therefore there is somebody else who is speaking, because the opposition, as I have said, is a spirit, and that spirit must find somewhere where it must land,
yes,
and find expression. And I think that is why you increasingly hear William Ruto, who is the deputy president, seeming to be articulating issues from what one would say is the alternative standpoint. And it's not the first time, therefore, in this country that we see the second in command being the person who now seems to be the voice of the opposition.
Okay. Gentlemen, I want very short answers on this because I need to play the video of the week so that we comment on that briefly. But do you believe that this is on the BBI because of the handshake? We've spoken about the handshake, it's the anniversary. But I just want to know your opinion based on what has been happening. Do you believe that the problems, the housekeeping issues that Junaid Mohammed was telling me have been sorted out, and going forward we are likely to see the Secretariat working like it's intended to work? Let me begin with Steve.
I think the problems within the BBI Secretariat may in fact be solved quickly because the President has a discernible interest in the outcome of the BBI and the intended BBI Constitutional Amendment Bill 2020. So yes, there's a decent chance that the squabbling and the murmurs may be addressed, you know, because again, there have been reports that all this it's about money, management of money, and the tacit support the ODM wing of political. I was nearly saying political government because they're like in government. The ODM wing expect to extract the political dividend. They expect to extract from this handshake.
Yeah.
So yes, we will see this resolved.
All right. Dr. Muluka.
Yes, I think it's going to be resolved. It's in the interest of the two BBI principles that the BBI process comes to the logical conclusion that they intended it. And so in the short term, I think it is going to be resolved. And after the BBI referendum, sometimes I've heard people suggesting that they may even enact it without going the referendum way. I don't know how. Lawyers like Steve Ogola can tell us that. But whatever the case, after that process comes to maturity, then the real politics will begin unfolding. We are going to see a lot of alliance formation. You asked earlier on why people cannot just collapse their parties and work together. The reason is very simple, Ken, that in Kenya we excel in the politics of betrayal, and you better have your little raft that you hold onto. You have seen what is happening in Jubilee to those who folded their parties to get into the behemoth that is Jubilee, the Titanic, the unsinkable one. And you take lessons from situations such as those. And so parties being formed basically as vehicles for winning elections and nothing beyond that. You want to hold on to yours so that in the future you are able to rein in your MPs and you do not risk them being taken away by the dominant voice in the political formation.
Okay, and that's perhaps is the reason why Kingi in Mombasa is pushing for an independent party. But that's a discussion for another day, gentlemen, because I really want to talk about cost when we meet next. But before we conclude this discussion, let's take a look at the video of the week, because it's the handshake anniversary, the third, in fact. And perhaps, if I'm not wrong, this is where it started.
Tunaongea na sauti ya Wakenya wote ambao ndio wako wengi. Ndio sababu leo tumekuja hapa Embakasi kutoa azimio la Embakasi. Hiyo ni azimio ya Nairobi ya kwamba.
Of course, gentlemen, that did not happen. but the repeat election happened. We have 2 minutes on the clock. I'll give you an opportunity to close with this, Steve.
I think this is the thing, yeah? On the political processes, the process and prelude to the Constitution Amendment Bill 2020 is fraught with serious constitutional and legal challenges. You cannot decide as a contestant and a key player that you're ready on your own terms from a purely constitutional viewpoint. It's a very dangerous and reckless statement, even if you find it difficult to call it out, but that's just how it is, yeah? The way election management happens is that you document the challenges you've seen. The only time you boycott election is if there's a climate of fear that makes it difficult for you to access, to campaign and access your voters. But you can't be the one creating that climate of fear and then extracting political benefit, dividends from it. And when the Supreme Court pronounces itself, which, by the way, within our hierarchical order, has the last word on election management, you may disagree, but you cannot usurp the formal authority of the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And then to swear. There needed to have been an honest admission before the handshake that what happened on 30th January 2018 was a near constitutional coup, properly so-called.
Okay.
That didn't happen. Okay. Be it as it may, the BBI bill must terminate at the ballot for at least 2 reasons. Number one, although this bill was a purely parliamentary initiative because it was state-funded and to support it, the steering committee was gazetted as a presidential task force, but it somehow camouflaged, it was somehow camouflaged as a popular initiative bill.
Okay.
A popular initiative within the meaning of Article 255 must terminate in a referendum.
Exactly.
The second thing, there are serious constitutional changes the bill is proposing that it affects separation of powers, collapsing the role of Parliament and the National Assembly together. Now you can appoint ministers from the counties, from the National Assembly, undermining judicial independence. I think these matters and others must go to the ballot because they affect the protected provisions under the Constitution. In short,
you need to conclude.
Kenyans will decide the fate of the BBI, the constitutional bill at the ballot. There cannot be any other way to run away from it except through a framework of impunity, as Barack likes to call it.
Barack, unfortunately, he's eaten your half a minute, so
yes, but I'd just like to say that that clip that you have shown vindicates what I've been saying here time and again, that there were 11 irreducible minimums. They have not been addressed, and we are going to a referendum later on to a general election. And the problems that we have had in the past will be with us again, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, because they are not substantially addressed. All right, gentlemen, I don't know if we have the newspaper so that we tell you what to expect in the headline. Do you have it? All right. We have the newspaper for tomorrow. So this is the headline in the Standard, just coming up in a second or so. All right, so what's ailing Raila Odinga? Raila Odinga is currently at the hospital, and he was taken ill yesterday. And, of course, we have been told he's in high spirit, but that's it. So read about the tests that were done, and he was being monitored and investigations being done. You read about why he is in the hospital, and of course the bombshell from the Ministry of Health that the city ICU facilities are now full. Very disturbing, but at least the other ones are still able to handle patients, and with the third wave of the coronavirus, it's dire, and we expect the president to talk about the curfews. So that's what we expect in the Standard tomorrow. Make sure you grab your copy. All right, Damien Evans, thank you so much, our sign language interpreter tonight. My name is Ken Mijungu. You have been watching News Hour. Thank you very much for watching. Sophia Wanuna will be here tomorrow with Crossfire. You need to look out for that. Of course, our broadcast goes on. We are live for you throughout the day and the night. Have a good night, and God bless.